Well, good morning, church, again. Good morning, Greece. Good morning, Arcade, Wellsville, Olean, Shingle House. We're glad that you guys are with us as well. If you're new, my name is Jeremy. I'm one of the pastors here. We're going to be in Ruth chapter 3. We're in a series called Ruth, The Road to Redemption. That's the subtitle. And we're going to do a little recap so that if you're new, you kind of see where we're at in the story. We left off in chapter 2, so we get chapter 1, chapter 2. Today's chapter 3. And chapter 2 ended with essentially Ruth gleaning in a field of a guy named Boaz. And we saw God's providential care at work. One of those, it just so happened moments where God shows up in natural ways and brings about supernatural outcomes. So Ruth is looking for favor, and she finds it in, of all places, a field. She finds favor in a field, and she's blown away by the generosity of this guy named Boaz. Boaz is a good guy. He's a generous guy. He provides for Ruth, gives her food, and he even welcomes her to his table. They kind of have like a little first mini date, They break bread, they drink wine, and this foreign outside Moabite is welcomed to this Israelite's table. It's kind of a cool picture that we see of communion, where we, outsiders, are welcomed to God's table to break bread and to drink wine. And so as we turn to chapter 3, we're left wondering, hopefully you're left wondering if you've been reading, where's this headed? Like where's all this going for this odd couple named Ruth and Boaz? It seems like God is up to something, but where is this leading? And so what I love about this story, all throughout Ruth, really, what I love about the story is that obviously when we read the Bible, you know that God is in charge of everything. He holds the universe together with his word and his mighty hand. But Ruth is not the 30,000-foot view of life. It's the 50-foot view, where God gets into the mess and the details of our life, and it reminds us that we serve a God who works through ordinary people, some ordinary Joes and some Schmoes and some Ruths and some Boaz, to bring about his good and perfect will in our life. And it also reminds me, which is good news because tomorrow's a Monday, that God works on Mondays and works on Tuesdays, and he works in the mundanes of our life to bring about his purposes and good will. So even when life, I said this yesterday or last week, when life feels like a field, you're like, I'm just in a field, I'm in a field. Take comfort. God works in fields. He works in ordinary places through ordinary means. That's what providence is. So this is how Ruth chapter 2, verse 23 ends. So she kept close to the young woman. This is she, Ruth, kept close to the young woman of Boaz, gleaning in the field, right, picking up the barley and all that stuff, gleaning until the end of the barley and wheat harvest. And she lived with her mother-in-law during that time. So think about this. Here's the picture. Day after day after day, Ruth shows up trying to do the right thing, not knowing what's coming ahead in the future. How long does she do that? Well, the wheat and barley harvest seasons could have lasted months. So this is like a 3 to 4 month period. So end of chapter 2, beginning of chapter 3, there's about 3 or 4 months in between there. And we don't know what's going on with Ruth. We don't know where this is leading with Boaz and Ruth. And we don't know how God is going to show up and provide. And so, in other words, Ruth just didn't look for favor one day. She looked for God's favor day after day after day. She kept showing up and doing the right thing. And so you can feel the weight of the family in this story, the weight that they're carrying, living day to day. I mean, a lot of us, we live day to day. We live week to week. We live paycheck to paycheck, wondering how God will provide in our, hopeless situations. And so, sure, God shows up one time in this story, really powerfully in Ruth chapter 2. But for that family, that's not enough. Like if the story ends in chapter 2, the story is not really a great story, and it doesn't lead to redemption. So the questions just pile up on top of one another by the time we get to the end of chapter 2. What will happen Will God provide for Ruth? What's going to happen with Boaz? How will Naomi provide for her family, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? There's so many questions lingering as we close chapter 2 and head into chapter 3. So imagine what it would have been like for this family just reeling from these circumstances, not just from bad circumstances, right? But also from some bad decisions. Let's not forget there was a guy named Elimelech, who was Naomi's husband, who died, who his name actually means my God is king, but he didn't live like his God was king. In fact, he decided to take matters into his own hands, move his family from what was called the house of bread, Bethlehem, into the house of pagans, where they worshiped and sacrificed idols and sacrificed children. Elimelech decided to do that. The result was the opposite of what he had hoped for. He dies. Mahlon and Chilion, their two sons, died, leaving behind 3 widows in a very, very tough situation. And so what does Naomi do? Naomi blames God, which is what a lot of us do, right? When life doesn't go our way in some way or another, some form or fashion, we end up blaming God. And for Naomi, it ends up with her changing her name from Pleasant, which is what Naomi means, to Mara, or Mara, whatever you say it, and that means bitter. So what do you do when life leaves you feeling very empty and bitter? And these are the circumstances in which she finds herself in. And so you put yourself in Naomi and Ruth's shoes, and you kind of have to be thinking like, okay, we messed up. We took life into our own hands. Things are not going well. We're in this hopeless situation, but we're back. Like, we're back in Judah, which means the land of praise. We're back in Bethlehem, which means the house of bread. God is somehow working, somehow providing. We're back, but are we ever going to move forward? Like, we're on the right track. I've repented, but I still got to deal with the consequences of my own decisions. I got to deal with the reality of what life brings me. And the question for many, many people is, can I ever recover from this? Can I ever recover from what I've done or what I've experienced? Naomi and her family wandered like 40 to 50 miles outside of God's will, God's plan, God's people. That's about the distance between Bethlehem and Moab. And yet they're back, and they're wondering how God is going to show up in their life. Or do they just have to settle for living a life that just feels so empty? Can you relate to what they're going through? You make a mistake, you repent, you turn around, you want to move forward, but you got to deal with the consequences. And there is that part of us that wrestles with, is this what it's at? It's like, am I just going to feel empty the rest of my life? Not have any purpose and hope? And so we can relate. And so I want you to see this. Our mistakes we make in the past often leave us feeling hopeless for the future. The mistakes that you and I, that we've made in the past, they really do often make us feel like there's no hope for the future. And so I've been there, you've been there, we've all been there. Our circumstances may not have been Ruth and Naomi's, but we all know what that feels like. The good news is this, that we worship a God today and tomorrow and whatever comes next week and next month. We worship a God who offers us a future despite our failures. God always offers us hope for the future despite our own failures. He really does. And so you're going to see that in this amazing passage that we're going to look at today as we try to kind of map out in real time, as we read this story, the road to redemption. And I want to point out 3 mile markers in this story so you can kind of get your framework, get your bearings about what's happening here, because it's a lot. There's a lot that's happening. I'm going to put it in 3 sections so you can kind of follow the road to redemption. Number 1 is this. You see Naomi's plan. Naomi has a plan, and it's a bold plan. It's a bold idea. Here's what it says in Ruth chapter 3, verses 1 through 4. It says, then Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, my daughter, should I not seek rest for you, that it may go well with you? Before we go on, okay, before we go on to the next verse, let me just point out, Naomi has good intentions, okay? Remember that. Naomi has good intentions. Many of us, when we come up with a plan, we have good intentions, regardless of how it works out, but she has good intentions. Then it says this, verse 2. Is not Boaz our relative, with whose young woman you were? See, he is winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor. Now, what's going on here? Naomi, the mother-in-law, is playing matchmaker, right? She's trying to turn up the heat on this relationship. You had your first date a few months ago. Now let's turn the heat up. Let's get you a man. That's what that means in Hebrew. Let's get you a man, okay? Verse 3, it says this. Wash, therefore, and anoint yourself and put on your cloak, which, put on your nice clothes, and go down to the threshing floor. But do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. Okay, so what does Naomi say to do? Wash, which is not bad advice if you want to find a spouse, right? Got to take a bath, got to take a shower, got to brush your teeth. You got to wash. So she's off to a good start. I mean, if there was a manual for how to get a mate, how to get a spouse, that's step one. All right. Step two. Smell nice. Anoint yourself. Put on perfume. Put on that Bethlehem Bliss, only available at Macy's, right? Get yourself some of that. That's step 2. Smell nice. Step 3, don't approach, and ladies, you got to know this about guys, okay? Don't approach a hangry man, right? When we're hungry, we always respond better to your request when after we eat chicken wings, not beforehand, right? So she's off to some really good advice here. And then we get to verse 4, okay? But when he lies down, observe the place where he lies, then go, uncover his feet, and lie down, and he will tell you what to do. Okay, what? Did I read that right? Did you see that right? What's going on here? Naomi tells Ruth to wash herself. All right, okay. Put on your best perfume. Gotcha. Dress nicely. We're on a roll. Head to the threshing floor. Wait till the man has eaten and drank. Note where Boaz is sleeping. Uncover his feet. Lie down next to him. And wait for him to tell you exactly what to do. Can I just say, as your pastor, that's a terrible idea. Dads, if you're looking for advice to give to your daughter on dating, don't do that. Hey, go sneak over to the men's dorm, at the college or whatever, and sneak up next to him and whisper in his ear, I'll do whatever you tell me to do. No, it's horrible advice. But it's in there, right? It's in the Bible. And it points out the fact that there's parts of the Bible that we read that are prescriptive, right? What you read, you should do. What you read, this is how you should live your life. And then there's parts of the Bible that are just descriptive. Like, that's what happened. It's not telling you how to live. It's just telling you what actually happened, which I love the Bible. It keeps it real. This is what happened in their culture. And there's a lot of cultural nuances of this. And it may not be all bad advice. It's just kind of sketchy. It's a little shady here, okay? So, we need to understand that. Now, no one should read this passage and get some really creative writing ideas of how to win your spouse. Winning your spouse by uncovering their feet, right? That's not what this passage is about. What is this passage about? What this passage shows is how Naomi once again takes matters into her own hands. God didn't tell her to come up with this plan. She takes matters into her own hands, which we saw how that ended in chapter 1. It didn't really end all that well for this family in chapter 1. So she kind of senses in chapter 2 that God is at work, providentially at work, but she has a plan. And I can commend her effort. It's a valiant effort. It's a bold idea, but it's a bad idea. And it's always a bad idea to start stepping on God's toes when he's trying to lead you in the dance of where you're to go in life. Think of some of the things that make this story bad or challenging. Think about this. Ruth goes out in the middle of the night when wild animals could have attacked her to a place where there's a group of men drinking. That's probably not a good idea. And if Boaz doesn't receive Ruth and welcome her, she could just be thrown out. Like, she could be reported. Like, what are you doing, lady? What are you doing? So her reputation could have been ruined. She could have been attacked. It could have been dangerous. The whole thing is just a mess. It's a bad plan, but you see a good God. It's a bad sometimes we have bad plans, but we also have a good God. And God works somehow, some way, bad plans into his perfect will. That's how God works. And so that leads to the second point, the mile marker that I want you to see, and that is this, Ruth's obedience. So you see Naomi's plan and then Ruth's obedience. And the subtitle of this section would be a faith-filled risk, a faith-filled risk. So look at verses 5 through 7. It says, and she replied, all that you say, I will do. All that you say, I will do. So she went down to the threshing floor and did just as her mother-in-law had commanded her. And when Boaz had eaten and drunk and his heart was merry, he went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain. Then she came softly and uncovered his feet and laid down. Now, what I find interesting is that this is a little countercultural to what we experience, right? Ruth is the one pursuing Boaz, which in that culture, it would have been okay and acceptable because she was the one needing to be redeemed. And so a lot of times the people needing to be redeemed and recovered and, be given hope would go out looking for their redeemer. So this wasn't too abnormal, but typically, especially in our culture, it's the opposite. It's the guys pursuing the girls. It's the guys proposing to the girls. It's the guys pursuing, the girls in a relationship. I don't know if I've ever told you this before. I think some of you have heard this before. Maybe you haven't. But when Aaron and I met, it wasn't me pursuing Aaron. It was actually Aaron pursuing me. And let me tell you how it happened. She was my internet stalker. Okay, I'm telling you, she was. Go ask her afterwards. Do I need to explain that? So I was on the men's basketball team at Houghton College, now university, and she started looking up the men's basketball profile pictures, and she's like, oh, he's cute. And so I was like, oh, okay. And she noticed that I was from Wilson, New York. That's where my hometown is, and she has a relative in Wilson, New York, and she used that bit of information, her internet stalking research, to approach me and to break the ice, and we met, and that's how all love stories start. It's through internet stalking. And so we did that, and then we hadn't started dating yet, and she also pursued me by putting a can of mandarin oranges on the steps of my dorm so that when I went out to go work out, like 5 in the morning, we had mandatory practices, I would get very, very weak. I'd get low blood sugar, and I would sometimes pass out. She knew that through some conversations, so she put the can of mandarin oranges on the steps, and when I went out there, she wasn't there. No one was there. I just saw a can of mandarin oranges with a note that says Jeremy on it. And so that was our start of our love story. She pursued me. Here's the point. Sometimes guys need a little push, right? Guys, we need a little encouragement. That's what you see here in this story. Ruth is being very forward. She's taking some courageous steps forward to pursue this guy named Boaz. And it's kind of an interesting story. It's crazy, though, that when you look at the circumstance, she's the worker of the field. He's the owner of the field. That's weird. And it's amazing how God worked in that. So she goes out to the threshing floor. And the question that I'm wondering as she's making her way to the threshing floor, there's a walk there, is what is she thinking? What is she feeling? What's going through her head? Is she like really nervous? Is her heart pounding through her chest? What's going through her head? Or maybe she's just like really giddy, singing the whole time. I'm going to the threshing floor and gonna get married, right? What's going through her head? We don't know exactly what's going through her head, but we do know that she has absolutely no clue how Boaz is going to respond to Naomi's bold plan. But she does decide to take steps of obedience, even though she doesn't know the full plan. In other words, Naomi initiates the plan, but Ruth still needs to act on the plan. And I think the same is true in our lives. There's going to be points in our life when we can't always see the next step, but we do need to choose to follow his plan. Isn't that true? Most decisions that we make in life that involve faith-filled risks, God doesn't lay out the plan from A to Z. But you're sensing in your spirit that God's calling you to do something. And in that moment, you have a choice. You might know the first step, but you might not know the third step. But you take the first step in obedience, trusting that God actually has a plan and knows what he's doing. Just because you can't see how it's going to work out doesn't mean that you should just sit standing around and wait and do nothing. What it means is that you trust in God's providential care in your life as you move forward with discernment. Like that's part of that ingredient, discernment and prayer and asking for counsel and wisdom. And I think Ruth does that, albeit some of a bad plan that she had to work through. The truth is, some people, though, are so afraid of moving in the wrong direction that they end up moving in no direction at all. And they've been Christians for however many years, but they've never taken a step of faith that requires an all-out commitment to God's providential care in their life. Ruth doesn't have all the details of the plan, but she decides to go to the threshing floor and trust God with the details. This is a faith-filled risk. And again, the whole thing is not a good look. Ruth could get killed, she could get jumped, reputations could be thrown out, et cetera, et cetera. But the only reason why this story works, the only reason why we have this story called Ruth in the Bible is because of the hand of a gracious God, and there was a man full of integrity, a worthy man, the Bible calls it, which leads to the third mile marker that we see in this story of the road to redemption, and that is Boaz's integrity. He was a worthy man. Look what it says in verses 8 and 9. It says, at midnight, the man was startled and turned over, and behold, a woman lay at his feet. And then what it says in verse 9, he said, who are you? And she answered, I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer. Guys, can you imagine this happening? You're sleeping, and all of a sudden you feel something at the edge of the bed of your feet, and it's not your dog, right? It's a lady. Of course he was startled. It's like, whoa, who are you? I think that's the tone of that passage. Who are you? Not, who are you? No, he's startled. He doesn't know what's going on. And she answers. She says, I am Ruth, your servant. And then she says, spread your wings. Or another translation says garment, which makes sense. Like he would have been clothed, maybe some blankets over him or something. So she says, spread your garment or your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer. Now, what's interesting about that word wings is it's the same word that's used in last week's chapter 2, verse 12. Let me show it to you. Same Hebrew word where Boaz is speaking to Ruth, and Boaz says to Ruth, kind of like a blessing or a prayer, he says, the Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. Same word. So notice what's happening here. There's so many names in this story. Boaz pronounces a blessing over Ruth. And part of that blessing is that she would take, refuge, rest, get protection, provision, all that stuff under the wings of the Lord in who she is trusting. That's his prayer. That's his blessing on her life. And Ruth comes to the threshing floor and says, hey, Boaz, why don't you be the answer to my prayers? Why don't you do for me what you were praying for me back in chapter 2? In other words, she's fully trusting that God is going to provide, but he's going to provide through someone who is praying for her. I think that's neat. I think there's probably a lot of things that we could do in people's lives. We could probably be the answer to a lot of people's prayers that we've been praying for them if we would just step into their life and be a helping hand for them. You know, we can say we can pray for them, but when we can do something for them, not always, we can't do everything for everybody all the time, but when we can step into that situation and be a help to them. Now, Naomi calls Boaz her redeemer. She says these words, you are a redeemer. That's an important phrase, a redeemer, not the redeemer, but she says you are a redeemer. And so remember from chapter 2, Naomi pointed out to Ruth, the mother-in-law pointed out to the daughter-in-law that Boaz was one of her kinsman redeemers, which if you're not familiar with those terminology, it's part of the Old Testament law that Moses gave to the people, that God provided. And part of the Old Testament law, it was a way for God to provide for these widows who were destitute and poor. I'll quickly show you, okay? This is where it's from. Deuteronomy chapter 25. It says, if brothers dwell together and one of them dies and has no son, right? Which is essentially what happened with Elimelech and Naomi. They had 2 sons, but then those 2 sons died. The wife of the dead man shall not be married outside the family. Who's the wife of the dead man? We got Naomi and Ruth. Shall not be married outside the family to a stranger. Her husband's brother shall go into her and take her as his wife and perform the duty of a husband's brother to her. And then verse 6 says, and the first son whom she bears shall succeed to the name of his dead brother, that his name may not be blotted out of Israel. We talked about that last week. Like, this is a critical moment in this family's life. This could have been the end of the family called Naomi and Elimelech. This is it. But God made a provision in his law. And there's really 2 Old Testament laws at work here. This one's called the law of the levirate, not a lever like on a machine, but lever is a translation of the Hebrew word for brother-in-law. And so God says to the brother-in-law, you need to take this woman as your wife to provide for her so that she has a future. The other law is the kinsman redeemer that the Old Testament law talks about, which is a close relative who has the opportunity, had to have the rights and the resources and the resolve to do it, but they have the opportunity to purchase the land of that family back into the family so that they don't lose it. It was God's way of preserving that family's inheritance. So these 2 Old Testament laws are going on. And what's interesting is that this is really important because Ruth was a daughter-in-law. Okay, that Ruth was not Elimelech or Naomi's daughter. She was the wife of one of the sons, Mahlon or Chilion. And so because Ruth was the daughter-in-law, Boaz didn't have any legal obligation to do what she was asking her to do. That's important. Let me put it this way. Any actions on behalf of Boaz, a kinsman redeemer, would not come as a requirement of the law, but it would be based on the generosity of his heart. And you see that generosity in the following verses. So here's what verses 10 through 14 say. And he said, may you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. This is Boaz to Ruth. You have made the last kindness greater than the first. Well, what was the first kindness? The first kindness was you could have stayed in Moab where you knew everybody, but you decided to leave your family and friends and go with Naomi, your mother-in-law, to provide for her. That's kindness. And not only did you do that, you didn't sit on the living room couch waiting for bread to show up. You went out into the field and you provided day after day, month after month for your mother-in-law. That's the first kindness. But the last kindness is you have no legal obligation to marry an old man like me. You could get anyone on the street, but you chose me. That's kindness. This is Ruth's kindness. Now, keep in mind, this is around midnight, right? This is around midnight. This is after Boaz has had a few drinks, maybe, some good food. He's in some merry spirits. He's feeling good about himself. Ruth uncovers his feet, whatever that means. And this could have been This could have gone horribly wrong if Boaz wasn't a man of integrity. I mean, most guys in that type of situation would have taken advantage of that opportunity. But instead of taking advantage of the opportunity, Boaz chooses to do the right thing, even though he had the opportunity to do the wrong thing. And the reason why he chose to do the right thing over the wrong thing is because he's thinking long term. He's not thinking in the immediate. He's showing patience. And because he's showing patience, he's allowing himself to see Ruth not as some object to be used, but as someone who could be blessed. That's the type of man that Boaz was. He was given plenty of opportunity to do the wrong thing. But instead of doing the wrong thing, he chose to do the right thing. He says in verse 11 through 14, he says, "And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all that you ask. For all of my fellow townsmen know that you are a worthy woman. And now it is true that I am a redeemer. Yet there is a redeemer nearer than I. Remain tonight, and in the morning, if he will redeem you, good, let him do it. But if he is not willing to redeem you, then as the Lord lives, I will redeem you. Lie down until the morning." And then so she lay at his feet until the morning, but arose before one could recognize another. And he said, let it not be known that the woman came to the threshing floor. So it's a beautiful picture of Boaz, a worthy man, and a man full of integrity, because he trusts his integrity and he trusts her motives. He allows her to stay there, which also not great advice. But she stays there overnight. Why? Because he's concerned about her protection and her reputation. And then there's something really interesting that also happens here. Did you notice that Boaz just slips into the conversation, the story, that there was this other guy? There's another redeemer that's actually closer in kin to Ruth than Boaz is. I mean, this is a love story, right? It's part of a love story. What a wet blanket on a love story. I mean, imagine if the story just ended like that. Oh, it was going really well, and then chapter 3 happened and nothing. This relationship didn't go anywhere. What a horrible story. I mean, everything is going right for this couple until we get to verse 12, and we realize there's this other guy. And so we don't know much about this other guy, but what we're going to find out next week, I'll give you a little teaser, next week we're going to discover that, he's kind of a bozo. He's kind of a bozo. In fact, since we never learn his name, let's just call him Bozo for the next couple weeks. That'd be fun, okay? So we have Boaz and Bozo, okay? And I'm going to spoil this part of the story. We learn in chapter 4 that Bozo was given the opportunity to be the Redeemer. And you know what his first response was? Land? Gotta get me some land, some good land. Yeah, man, I want to buy that land. And then they throw in the fact that, that land also comes with a wife, a Moabite wife, and a bitter, angry mother-in-law. You know what he did? It's like, someone else can take the land. I don't want to. And Bozo didn't recognize what Boaz recognized. And that was the fact that Ruth, albeit a Moabite, was a woman of noble character. It kind of seems like we have a bunch of bozos in our society. Can we just be real? A bunch of people who are trying to find a mate, trying to find a date, trying to find a spouse, and they're looking for all the wrong things in all the wrong places. And instead of looking for a person of noble character, they'll be like, he's so hot. And she's so hot. Well, so is hell, right? It's better to marry a woman of noble character. It's better to find a spouse of noble character than just focus on the just superficial stuff that our world focuses on. So what I love about Boaz is that he wants God's will over his own way. Boaz wants God's will over his own way, and he's willing to see this process through for however long. He's willing to see it through so that it's on God's timing, not his own. Kind of completely opposite of the Elimelech story, the Naomi story, where they're trying to take matters into their own hands. And he's willing to accept what the Lord gives and be content with it, and what the Lord withholds from his life. And he's perfectly fine with that. He's a man of integrity, which, kind of little side note, when you read the book of Ruth and you hear about Boaz, there should be a voice in the back of your head going, this guy sounds familiar. This guy looks familiar. Because all throughout the Bible, in the Old Testament, there are pictures of grace that God gives us that point forward to our coming Redeemer, which is Jesus. Jesus is a worthy man. Jesus is a man full of integrity. Jesus desires, even in the Garden of Gethsemane, God's ways, his Father's ways over his own will. This is a picture of Jesus, and he's a worthy man. So those three kind of mile markers kind of plot the story out. And I threw a lot at you. That's what you need to know about chapter 3. But the question is, what do you need to do as a result of what you learn from chapter 3? I got a couple thoughts, and then we're gonna close. Number one, it's kind of next steps. Number one, we'll skip that one. I don't have time. I preached too long. Sorry. Number one, be willing to take some faith-filled risks. Be willing to take some faith-filled risks. Naomi, we already talked about Naomi's faith-filled risks. She blindly just goes in and obeys everything that Naomi told her to do, sort of, and she kind of goes off script there, but she takes a faith-filled risk for certain. But did you notice there's another faith-filled risk in this story? It's a big one, and it's the risk that Boaz takes. He's about to marry a Moabite. I don't know if we talked about this yet. You know how the Moabites came to be? You know how, some of you got some past baggage in your family history? Not like this one, okay? Probably not like this one. This is how the nation of Moab started. Genesis 19, 30 through 33, it says this. Now Lot, you guys probably heard about Lot. Lot went up out of Zoar and lived in the hills with his 2 daughters. You got 2 ladies, right? Similar story. You got Naomi and Ruth, Orpah and Ruth, you got 2 daughters, and here you got 2 daughters. For he was afraid to live in Zoar, so he lived in a cave with his 2 daughters. And the firstborn said to the younger, our father is old, and there is not a man on earth to come into us after the manner of all the earth. Verse 32, come, let us make our father drink wine, okay? And we will lie with him that we may preserve offspring from our father. Go back, John. This is the issue, by the way, at stake in Ruth. This is what's at stake. There's a family line that is at risk of ending. But in this story, these 2 daughters, these 2 women, take vastly different approaches, okay? Next verse, 33. So they made their father drink wine that night, and the firstborn went in and lay with her father. He did not know what she laid down or when she arose. There's more to it. We don't need to read more. That's how the nation of Moab came to be, through incest. Some similarities, some major differences. Major differences. So think about this. There had to be people looking at this love story, watching it on, The Bachelor or something like that. I don't know. And looking at it and thinking, that's how this whole thing got started. What are you doing, Boaz? Why would an Israelite ever marry a Moabite? That's what got us into this mess to begin with. What are you thinking? Think of how risky this was for Boaz to go into the town and say, I'm going to redeem this girl. I'm going to redeem this girl. I don't care what you say. I know what I'm called to do. It's a faith-filled risk. And yet this story is so, we're going to see this next week, it's so central to the storyline of Scripture that if this Israelite doesn't take a step of faith to marry this Moabite, you and I are not here. There are times in our life, go ahead, John. There are times in life when you can't always see the plan, but you do need to take a step, right? And let me say this, you also can't let the possibility of a wrong decision keep you from moving forward in the right direction. Some of you are so concerned about making a wrong decision that you're literally moving in no direction. This question came to me this week when I was studying to ask our congregation, what are you doing in your life that requires faith? What are you going after in life that really does require God to intervene? And if the answer is nothing, maybe this point would speak to you today, that God would use you to respond in faith to him. The second next step that I want to leave you with is this, and that is you need to trust in God's loving kindness. Trust in God's loving kindness. This is how the story ends. Verse 15, and he said, bring the garment you are wearing and hold it out. So she held it, and he measured out 6 measures of barley. 6 measures of barley, and put it on her. I'm pretty sure she was hoping for something else. Maybe a diamond ring or something, but she got 6 measures of barley. And then she went into the city. Then, and when she came to her mother-in-law, she said, how do you fare, my daughter? How did you fare? Then she told her all that the man had done for her, saying, these 6 measures of barley he gave to me. For he said to me, you must not go back empty-handed to your mother-in-law. You must not go back empty-handed to your mother-in-law. And she replied in verse 18, wait, my daughter, until you learn how the matter turns out, for the man will not rest, but will settle the matter today. That's the very first time in the story that we ever see Naomi wait. She's always running out in front of God with plans. She finally waits, and what's the result? God does for her immeasurably more than what she could ever ask. Six measures of barley was like 40 to 50 pounds. Does Ruth need all that barley? Ruth doesn't need all that barley. I think it was Boaz's message to Naomi to remind her that she's not empty and that she doesn't have to live life feeling empty. That points back to exactly what Ruth said in chapter 1 as she's heading back into Bethlehem with no husband and no sons and no food. She says this. She says, I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back, what? Empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has testified against me and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me? She's in a horrible spot in life. She actually thinks that God is against her, forgetting the fact that what got her into this mess was her and her husband taking matters into their own hands. And Boaz, being a worthy man, a man in the likeness of Jesus, looks at her and says, Naomi, you don't have to do life on your own anymore. You don't have to take matters in your own hands anymore. You can actually trust that I have a good plan for you and that I will provide for you and that you're not alone and that I'll never leave you, nor will I forsake you. I'm going to redeem your daughter-in-law, and that means you're going to be grafted into the family. This is a beautiful picture of the gospel. And just as Ruth had to cast herself down at the feet, literally the feet of Boaz, and be covered by his garment, so too you and I are invited to cast our feet, cast ourselves at the feet of Jesus, and be covered with the garment of his grace. It's a beautiful picture of the gospel. As we end chapter 3, we're going to go into chapter 4 next week and finish out the story and see how it all comes together. I want to invite our worship teams to come forward as we close in prayer. Lord, thank you for this wonderful story. Thank you for how you worked in Ruth and Naomi's life. It's kind of a mirror in how you work in our life, Lord. When we're tempted to take matters into our own hands and to do life our own way and to get ahead of you, this is a reminder for us to surrender and to trust in your providential care for our lives. Lord, we're grateful for the seemingly faith-filled risk that you took to step out of heaven, to leave the riches of a perfect place and in perfect communion with your Father, and to take on our sin. Lord, forgive us of the times that we take that for granted. Forgive us of our sin that separates us from you. I pray, Lord, that we would learn, just as Naomi did, just as Ruth did, to trust in the invisible hand of a good God. In your name we ask this, Lord. We love you. In Jesus' name, amen.